please warmly welcome our next speaker, Miss Michaela Lanni, and her thesis, Can I Take Communion? I don't know. Can you? A theological argument for traditional communion.
When I was younger and I wanted something, I would always ask my parents, can I? Can I have a piece of candy? Can I go to her house to play? My hopes were always crushed with their reply, I don't know, can you? My parents endlessly taught me the difference between ability, asking can I, and permission, asking may I. Remember this as I go through my arguments. Whoever therefore eats of the bread and drinks of the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will eat and drink judgment upon himself. In 1 Corinthians 11, Paul warns the Corinthians and all Christians against unworthy participation in the Lord's Supper. So, what is the Lord's Supper? What are its requirements? I know I can take it, but should I? When I was younger, I heard a church girl exclaim, I am so excited for the bread on Sundays. It looks so good. This statement shocked me because of her earthly desire to eat the bread. It was then that the lessons of ability versus permission entered my mind, as I realized that this girl had ability to take the Lord's Supper, but it was clear she should not yet have permission based on that statement. There are churches in our community that allow children much younger than this girl, even infants, to partake in the Lord's Supper, thus practicing paedo-communion. But partakers cannot be ignorant. The church must change to determine and direct those who may partake in the Lord's Supper. We must struggle with the may I argue for traditional communion. This means that partakers of communion must be baptized, make a profession of faith, and have discernment of the Lord's body. These requirements imply an age barrier on participants. I will focus my time today on the requirements of professions and discernment. In order to understand that someone is a believer, they must make a profession of faith. Dutch theologian K. Deddens feels that man is not permitted to partake in the Lord's Supper when he has disbelief in God. This standard for adults in regards to participation should be held up for children as well. As the philosopher Justin Martyr said, this food among us is called Eucharistia, of which no man may partake unless he believes that the things we teach are true. Again, we cannot know if someone is a believer until they profess it, but who would make this profession? Well, anyone who has the ability. Infants do not. Deddens also uses Article 35 of the Belgic Confession in support of saying, finally, we receive this holy sacrament, and we confess our faith and our Christian religion. Therefore, let no man come to the table without careful examination, lest by eating the bread and drinking the cup, he eat and drink judgment upon himself. This quote clearly states the requirement of confessing our faith and our Christian religion, but young children cannot cognizantly do this. Another support of traditional communion can be found in 1 Corinthians 11, where Paul writes a letter to the Corinthians during their times of great sin. Verse 28 commands, let each man examine himself, and so eat of the bread and drink of the cup. This examination largely refers to discernment of the body. Jeffrey J. Myers, a graduate of multiple theological seminaries, translates examination to mean that man must prove himself before partaking. This self-examination, or proof, can be understood as different types of discernment, these types being man's treatment of the body of Christ and man's understanding of the body of Christ. Man's treatment of the body of Christ can be most easily understood as loving your neighbor as yourself, while man's understanding, or discernment, means to recognize the salvation that Christ won for us with his body on the cross. Understanding can also mean seeing the bread and wine as sacred elements, thus setting apart these earthly elements into the sacred setting of this holy sacrament. Some may question how an infant can possibly partake of the Lord's Supper unworthily when they have no ability to communicate or even sin against others. We should welcome children to the table because nothing they do is purposely evil. This belief is conceivable, yet it has major flaws. Human children are sinful and born into sin. Because everyone is sinful, Everyone should be held accountable for their actions, held to the same requirements. It is incorrect to say that children do not have the capability of mistreating others. The Westminster Larger Catechism supports this. In question and answer number 22, it states that Adam's posterity, mankind, fell under the same covenant punishment as Adam, of bearing a sinful nature and the possible eternal punishments that come with it. Humans are sinful and born into sin. Babies are born into sin, therefore having no control over their sinful nature. Although sin is frequently a conscious act, because of our lack of control over our nature, adults and children often will sin unconsciously. Leviticus 5:17 states that if anyone sins and did not know it, he shall still bear his punishment. Again, because of our lack of control over our sinful nature, children do not naturally know about the Lord's Supper, and they must be introduced, lest by sinning unconsciously, they partake of the Lord's Supper unworthily. This subject matters now for parents, adults, pastors. The time is now to evaluate yourself and to follow God's commands. Parents, what will you do to ensure a proper participation and true faith to the best of your ability? Where do you stand in your understanding of this holy sacrament? Remember the young girl I mentioned earlier and her earthly desire for the bread? Imagine a new scenario. She runs to her father's arms at church, exclaiming, "I am so excited for communion. It is Jesus' body and blood. I am a sinner, but he died for my sins." There is purity in her desire to partake. Having both ability and permission, she can and may partake. To wait for participation of the Lord's Supper is not a hindrance to you or your children. Instead, fulfilling the requirements of baptisms, professions, and discernment is an opportunity for you to follow God's law and become worthy partakers in the Lord's Supper. Thank you.